Hello, this is Dawn, and this is Soul Simple Life Shifts, where we take a look at some of the shifts that we're invited to make, moving from how we've always done it before, or the things that were handed down to us, into an expanded array of options or possibilities. And today we are looking at hierarchy. And I want to say right from the outset that the intention of this series is to really look at what we individually can embrace or how we can shift in order to support the collective and to, quite frankly, just have a better quality of life. So this one is somewhat, we are used to looking at this hierarchy or patriarchy or other systems that are hierarchical in nature. We're accustomed to viewing big systems and structures in this way because it's quite obvious from a distance. But what I want to invite us into right at the outset is to consider ways that this is at play in you or in your immediate environment. In other words, in relationships, at work. It's probably easier to see there if you have a traditional career anyway. And also just in the ways that we think about and approach life. So I'm going to just dive into a couple of different examples of the ways that this plays out. Let me put my glasses on so I can read better. So typically in a hierarchical worldview, we are looking at, there's a chosen few, there's the elite, and they are endowed with special powers and special gifts, and they are set apart as some kind of higher echelon. And then the shift that we're invited to make is maybe to see each individual and each group or system within a larger society as one unique expression and as bringing different qualities to the table. So you see how this immediately shifts things, right? Because if you look at different societal levels that we're accustomed to, looking at, let's just say socioeconomic status or class systems, and this is in and of itself an example of hierarchical worldview. We are accustomed to putting people in categories. But in fact, there can be somebody in a, quote, lower class that is like genius level, like has solutions for humanity. And there can also be people in the upper echelons that really do not, are not connected to themselves and do not really bring value to the whole. And so it's a reduction because it's a way of looking at things that is just one dimension of a person or a group or a system. But let me go through the shifts first, then I'll come back to what we can do about it. So shift from the chosen few, the elite with special powers or special gifts, to all of us bringing what I would call expressions of the divine, or the one life, the one light, the one love. I said that backwards. One light, one life, one love. But even if you don't look at it through that lens, each person, each group, each system having something inherently of value to share, to bring forward, and being, just for the sheer fact that they are endowed with life, being a unique expression. All right, so another shift is from this idea of better than and less than, which we all, like in this world as it is currently, grew up with some level of that expression, better than to less than, to each as singularly magnificent and uniquely gifted. Shift from a step-by-step logical order only. There is value to logical order, but that being the only path, to the possibility of non-linear approaches or multiple points of connection or entry or expansion. Another shift is a preference for vertical movement to potential for lateral, concentric, or spiral movement. Another shift would be this idea, again, this goes with the vertical, would be this idea of like a Tower of Babel kind of thing. Like we're building to the all-knowing, all, all understanding spot up here, to sustainable webs that support and layered, interconnected webs that support the upliftment of all. Fixed systems driven from the top shift to dynamic systems coordinated from within, naturally and organically. And then the shift from, well, actually, this is more just images. I want to give you some images. So in the hierarchical kind of worldview, common imagery might be rungs on a ladder. You just go up the ladder. How far and fast you run the race of life, that's the horizontal plane, or the pyramid structure, who can get to the top fastest and maintain that position at the apex of the pyramid. Shifting to imagery such as, and this is not a complete list at all, I haven't done a lot of thinking about this, but I think that you can take this as a starting point and expand. So shifting to images such as King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, so the Round Table consensus, constellations, and the way that they're always changing in the seasons, the ever-shifting spiral staircase. Those are a couple of different images. So this whole thing of hierarchy, it actually is a template that we don't even see sometimes. And it can really influence even our own like self-growth and personal healing journey even. We can, like, let me give you an example there. We can see like, okay, healing, ultimate peace, love and joy in my life. And I have to get there by doing a lot of things. And those are the rungs on the ladder, right? Or the steps in the race. And before we know it, we're caught up in this comparison game, even if it's internal, comparison game to how we are compared to how others are, number one. And we are also pulled out of just being with the process because we typically are so fixated on whatever the guru or the source that we're looking to, usually external, is saying or suggesting, and we're trying to there's a lot of mental activity, right? We're trying to think about all that and then do it right, and it can become performance within the context of something even like personal growth and your healing journey. And so we don't realize that, but that actually is consistent with this hierarchical worldview. And so and also in relationships, this is another thing where it's very subtle how it shows up. And I don't just mean power dynamics where there's an obvious, although that is also a place it shows up because of preconceived notions that we all buy into. It's not necessarily just the, completely narcissist psychopath male who is dominating, although that is still present in our reality. But it's more that we all kind of without even knowing it, this is how the world has worked. And so we all almost treat it as if it's a given. And so the opportunity or the invitation here, which is slightly more subtle than some of the other ones, unless you want to be a revolutionary and disrupt, which, trust me, at times I have wanted to be, but the opportunity is to really look at what's happening in our internal environment, because it also can happen internally. We can create internal hierarchy. We can actually split ourselves and think, oh, there's the wise one in me, there's the all-knowing, right, the spiritual one. And then there's this, sad little inner child or happy little inner child, depending on how we're looking at it. But still, see how that's already a level. And then there's there's that angry part of me that has no place. And so right away, we are already creating these hierarchies within us. And so the opportunity internally and in all external situations is to expand how we are seeing the world gently, and to begin to introduce new images, new ways of seeing ourselves and others and the world around us, new ways of being ourselves and being in the context of relationships and with the larger world, and new ways of freeing ourselves internally, and also freeing ourselves from external fixed systems or worldviews that do not serve our own desires for our life. So let me just back up for just a minute and say, hierarchy is defined by this idea of subordination and superordination. So again, it's like very levels, right? And it shows up in so many ways. And so I really want to encourage you to start noticing all the ways it shows up. I'm not going to go into all that because I just couldn't possibly. And also, like I said, I feel like there's a lot of exploration for all of us to do around this topic. But in general, hierarchy implies this idea of levels. It implies a vertical, like relationship of status and importance and power, which, some people actually are still clinging to. I saw this so powerfully in the last 6 months, and I honestly was like a little bit like, wait, what? People still are thinking that way? Like, it really did surprise me. But I think that in some ways that's because they're in their bubble, like, so to speak, right? They're in their and by the way, saw it from both ends, like from the top, the elite, the people at the apex of their power that, like, I am a god, all the way down to, the people at the who would consider themselves to be at the very bottom of that. There's a lot of lack. There's a lot of, I'm doomed. There's no way out. I'm trapped. I must do these things. I must pray to the gods above, and then there can be then a false pattern that's created in those lower echelons for desiring like what's up there. And actually at the what I've also noticed, which I didn't know before, is in those higher echelons, there can, like if you've already dominated everything, what's the point, right? There can be a lot of introduction of other false patterns that have to do with, like, actually what's happening is you see the fallacy internally. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. And so there can be a lot of games that get more and more absurd. And we can see this societally. I can see it societally. I'm sure you can too. So this idea of subordination, superordination, levels, vertical relationship, reporting, control is infused throughout almost, if not all, hierarchical systems. Not to say that there isn't value sometimes in clearly defined roles and in systems that are very ordered and logical and where there is a chain of command. There is value sometimes in that. However, when the system of hierarchy itself, and that worldview in particular, when that is allowed to lead without being questioned, it can cause these patterns of disruption, disarray, and can actually be like counterintuitive. It can, or not counterintuitive, counterproductive. It can be completely counterproductive to the aims of such a system, or the stated aims anyway of such a system. All right, so I think I've belabored that enough, but there's control is infused throughout hierarchical systems. So with that being a given, the implication of control and this idea of levels, one gentle, soul simple life practice that you might look at and that I try to keep in mind. And again, this is one that's very, like, it's everywhere. When you start to really consider this, you'll see it in your own life, how you create it. You'll see it in relationships. You'll see it in work, even very collaborative ventures. You'll see some subtle ways that this is playing out. You certainly see it in society and systems, and we can see it internally, as I mentioned. So given this, one soul simple life practice that you might consider is what I think of as the natural level. One thing about hierarchical systems that I've always felt, and I don't know if others will resonate with this, but is that they're very forced, they're very rigid, and they're very like so ordered that it feels confining and constricting, I believe, to people no matter the level. Ultimately, it feels like a prison. And there are various ways people deal with that feeling, that resulting feeling. But let's look at natural, organic, life-giving systems. And so that's the natural part of the natural level. And then the level part is to really examine where are the levels here, and how can we not flatten always, but how can we infuse, or how can we level and distribute the energy. I am not talking about equal distribution of wealth or equal distribution of everybody gets power. I'm not necessarily talking about that. It's very nuanced, but this idea of natural and level, considering those two things, and using that as a measure, a soul simple life practice where we can examine our internal environment, our relationships, our different environments that we go into during the day, our community, our state, nation, world, cosmic view even, and really look at it, really be curious. What levels are operating here? And interesting, do I consent and agree to that worldview, or am I still like considering, or do I reject it? And then where does that lead me? So really do some internal reflection around this as you're moving through your life. This is an ongoing process, this one, but begin to examine the structures which you are creating, which you are connecting to, and which you are sustaining through your participation and consent. I'm not saying you should immediately break away from all systems that are a part of our current reality. Even I am not doing that. But there's a way that we can use this idea of the natural level. What's aligned with organic? How would life do this? And then the level, like the idea of a more equitable, but I do not mean all equal, but a more generous, life honoring way of seeing this, way of being in this, and a way of freeing, if that is something that we're called to, from this, or freeing within, being free within it. That's another example. So what we're doing here is expanding the frame of how we're viewing things and allowing for more room for curiosity and for observation and for the invitation for life to inform the structures and systems we create. And that begins within. Again, I know this one can feel very external, but it does begin with how we view ourselves internally, who we are, how we view ourselves as we move through our day. And if you are in a situation, as I once was, where you know that you have value intrinsically, you know this, and I'm talking when I was a child here, if I'm going to go that far back for just a minute, but for some reason the circumstances of your life, whatever that is, in your family dynamic or in what's happening to you perhaps, or how you feel, and you feel like a trapped animal, or like something huge is off, like there's been a vast reduction of who you are, then hold fast to that internal knowing and get curious and begin to ask, what would life say? What would the sun say to this situation What would the sun say to me, that part of me that knows? And what would the sun say to this? How would the sun shed light on this entire thing that's happening? Which, just so you know, the thing that I was thinking wasn't necessarily a huge hierarchical system. It actually was more direct relationship or small groups, but yet that hierarchical pattern was at play, whether any of the players knew it or not. In some cases, actually, with things that happened, they clearly knew it and were exercising and feeding it. But in other cases, it was much more subtle, such as family dynamics and systems. A lot of times, you know, you can go your whole life. I'm 62, and I venture to say I only know what I know because I started researching it, you know, well, lightly about 10 years ago, but came back to it, you know, about 3 years ago. I was like, okay, fine. Because I had before then just been trying to remove myself, get free, and then I'd come back in for a while. And I'm not saying that breaking away is necessarily the solution there, but the invitation to really observe and see what's at play. And so what I was about to say there was that I would venture to say that everybody that was a player in like a family dynamic or a particular group, like a community or work group, aren't aware. We're often unaware of the patterns, the energetic patterns at play. And those energetic patterns often come when we are all, without really knowing it, buying in to a template or an idea or a worldview that is just so predominant in our reality, and there are forces that will condition us to stay in that frame. And so the idea here today is simply to widen or expand the frame, examine the relationships, your internal relationship with you, the relationships that are at play in your life, your environments that you engage with, your community, and then, you know, other larger systems and structure. Just examine and just ask. Use that catchphrase of natural level. What would nature say? You know, I gave the example of the sun, but you could also use rain. You could also use grass, a blade of grass, the wind, the elements, fire. And this is a good way to begin to get curious and begin to notice things. And there's a lot here. I'll even share something here. When I started using this sort of natural level idea, not even necessarily about big systems or fixed hierarchies, but just about just getting curious with those two questions about different situations that I was in through the course of the day, it can get a little scary because you can begin to see how beholden we are, most of us, to these external ideas. And also you very clearly begin to see the manipulation. And the manipulation is infused throughout the system, any hierarchical system for sure, but throughout, it's like it permeates everything and all levels. And so that this feeds then this collusion, and it also keeps everybody at all these different, levels that they're supposed to operate at. It keeps all of us looping through our lives, as opposed to coming fully to life and living in full expression, as opposed to really stepping into that realm of radiance where we can expand into more of who we are and bring fully what we have to share with one another and create our lives and this world in such a way that everyone is freed and lifted into their highest potential. All right, I'll leave it at that. Just play with the ideas and consider.